Greetings. Do without wilt shall be the whole of the law. I'm Lexi Eve, and welcome back to another Walk Magick video. So today is another talk about sex magic, and it's the third in the series. And in this video, we're going to primarily cover the concept of the homunculus. Let's begin. The term homunculus is attributed to Paracelsus in his De Natura Reum, quote, that the sperm of man be putrefied by itself in a sealed curcubit for 40 days with the highest degree of putrefaction in a horse's womb, parentheses, or possibly horse dung by a literal translation, unparentheses, or at least so long that it comes to life and moves itself and stirs, which is easily observed. After this time, it will look somewhat like a man, but transparent, without a body. If after this, it be fed wisely with the arcanum of human blood, and be nourished for up to 40 weeks, and be kept in the even heat of the horse's womb, a living human child grows therefrom, with all its members like another child, which is born of a woman, but this much smaller. End quote. So, just going off script for a second, ideas similar to the homunculus have been used way prior to Paracelsus, as far as 300 AD, I want to say by Aristotle, I believe. You could find information on Wiki if you want those, but we're going to be looking at this from like a practical point of view, which is really my forte, as opposed to strictly historical. So you could do like a quick Wiki search if you want more historical information of that sort. So, the homunculus is a created artificial life form, imbued with magical properties and powers. But by definition, that covers a wide array of potential beings, from the making of a test tube baby, to the making of a golem with Qabalistic magic, to even Jesus. And I'm going to cover each of these in time. First, let us look at Liber 367, De Homunculo by Aleister Crowley. According to this text, the term homunculus is defined as, quote, a living being in form resembling man, and possessing those qualities of man which distinguish him from beasts, namely intellect and power of speech, but neither begotten and born after the manner of human generation, nor inhabited by a human soul, end quote. Essentially, in magic, it's the process of creating a life form, again with magical properties, and you're going to give it specific functions to carry out. As said, this can range from making golem to artificial intelligence of today ruled by certain principles to do mathematical functions. Say you charge it with Mars principles for war and Mercury principles for mathematics, and you give this AI the ability and the target to shoot long-range missiles from a computer with pinpoint accuracy. That could technically be a homunculus. And there's other better examples as given by Crowley in his novel Moonchild. About this latter method, Crowley concedes in Liber 367, quote, our method of producing that which, if not a true homunculus, at least serves all proper purposes thereunto pertinent, end quote. Real quick, one of the key differences between a Homo sapien and homunculus is the possession of a human soul. So that brings up the question, what is a human soul? Well, the problem with the word is the way that it's been used, the connotations it carries, how many definitions the words soul and spirit have, and that any label can never truly capture what a thing is, especially with something so complex and lacking of physical substance as does the spirit or soul. If you look up the etymology of the English word spirit, you will find that it comes from Latin spirare, meaning breath. This idea allegorically is one of the best defining traits by Kabbalah, as it connects with both the ruach, which is the intellectual part of the soul, and the middle pillar, which is air, so it encompasses Yesod up to Keter, the unconsciousness of the moon, the consciousness of Sol, and the divine light of Keter. The word spirit encompasses the soul, at least in my opinion, and the soul being the immortal part of the human being, the ego and the light, so to speak, perhaps that which carries the spark of creation, a divine godly thing within man, but that is cloaked in a ghostly form, such as the body of light. The homunculus has some kind of energy which animates it, perhaps a non-human soul. So that means a creature of spiritual nature is forced into the body of the homunculus, a creature that has simply never incarnated in human form prior, perhaps cannot otherwise incarnate as human, or perhaps it's a spark of light lacking humanness, ego, or emotion. It is commonly held in occult circles that the soul or ego enters the fetus at 6 months into the pregnancy. However, in Liber 367 de Homunculus, this text posits, quote, that the fetus is not human until 3 months of gestation. Further, for about 3 months the fetus is empty of any soul. It then attracts an ego of such a nature as A, its own karma, i.e. nature and tendency, and B, the karma of the ego, combined to make viable. If a suitable combination is not found, the result is either miscarriage, stillbirth, or the birth of an idiot, end quote. So I find a footnote to this passage quite hilarious. As a side note, quote, nobody is quite certain which of these three is an accurate description of Dan Quayle, or if he may be an example of some hitherto undisclosed accident of alchemy or toxic waste. End quote. Ha! Dan Quayle was vice president to George Bush Sr., and just as a joke, I believe the same thing could be said of the entire Bush family and probably the Trump family as well. Don't know whether it was an alchemical or toxic waste accident that created those lots of humans, for lack of a better word. So, if before that time when a human soul, an ego, or soul is attracted to the earth, a fetus, you direct a spirit or intelligence of a specific type instead into the fetus, it can incarnate and carry out functions suitable to its nature. This force can be elemental, planetary, zodiacal, or even a specific god, angel, spirit, or qliphoth, whatever. It is easier to get such a force into the fetus prior to once the human soul has entered. The human soul becomes tethered to the individual, and an invading spirit will combat with the person whose body it has invaded. If a magician or spirit is strong enough to force out the human soul completely so that it leaves to incarnate elsewhere whilst the invading force takes hold of the body, that person would be considered deceased and no longer who they were. They would be a homunculus. Otherwise, if both the person, their soul, and the invading spirit reside in the body at the same time, it is merely a case of possession. The second chapter of Liber 367 discusses an alchemical principle of making the homunculus. Quote, the classical method of making the homunculus is to take a fertilized ova of a woman and to reproduce as closely as may be without the uterus the normal conditions of gestation therein. End quote. So, at the time this text was written, science was not able to host an egg outside of the uterus. But with present advances in science, in vitro fertilization, meaning in a glass tube an egg is fertilized, is quite possible. The white eagle and red lion and other compounds necessary for life to form are thus mixed and gestation made possible. The fetus should form and be nurtured until it is grown and ready for, quote, delivery, unquote, so to speak. From before one mixes the seed and egg, and over the entire course of time it is growing, there should be rituals performed to attract whatever energies or spiritual beings one wishes to incarnate into the alchemical experiment. Now, I don't want to go too far into the scientific details of in vitro fertilization, but if you were interested in the subject, there's a 5-minute video you could find via a link in the description below. In short, in vitro fertilization is the process of harvesting eggs from the ovaries, which are placed in a petri dish and artificially inseminated. The fetus is grown in lab conditions similar to what environment it would grow in the womb. X amount of time goes by and a baby is born without a womb or person being necessary to carry it to term. In the spirit of science, one can hold the attitude that yes, making homunculus is an experiment and magic is scientific. Further, that above the abyss there is no right or wrong, good or evil. It's just science, and that's what it is. But below the abyss, there are moral implications of doing this, and I find doing this to any being is kind of terrible. So I'm definitely not for this practice. Creating life, even a human without a human soul, I find somewhat unscrupulous. The being born will still have a human brain, thus sensory perceptions like a human, and yet one would know it is not human and thus treat it like a spirit or subhuman. It's the classic case of Frankenstein. And personally, I emphasize with the monster. The real monster of the story is the Doctor. I digress. To create life in any form, to abuse by forcing it into some labor of one's own design, I just find wicked. Therefore, I share these ideas for the first time in the spirit of scholarship, not as one who advocates the practice, even though we're looking at this from a practical point of view. Just wanted to get it out there that I'm thoroughly against this practice as a whole. Moving on, part 3 of Liber 367, it begins, quote, "We assume that our brethren have well studied our Pistol de Art Magica," end quote. If you're not familiar with this small book, it has a ton of useful sex magic info. I might dedicate a future video solely to its content, but for now you could see parts 1 and 2 in this sex magic series, which covers a lot of that stuff. In this third section of the book, we have 2 more methods of creating a homunculus. The first is to dislodge a grown human soul and replace it with a specific spirit with magical properties. The second method is to impregnate a woman, and before the human soul is incarnated into the fetus, a spirit will be brought into it, carried to term, and birthed. Looking at the former process, which is not too lengthy, quote, "We once supplanted the soul of a Caliban creature, a cannibal, a certain deformed and filthy abortion without moral character, named Victor Nuber, by a soul of Isis, by a soul of Mars, and by a soul of Jupiter in turn, so that this quasi-human shape, not being a poet, did yet write verses goodly and great in praise of Isis, and not being a prophet, did yet foretell most accurately the wars which even now devastate the earth, and not being generous or wealthy, did yet for a season support many dependents on his bounty," end quote. A footnote about this passage informs us that it refers to sex magic utilized by Crowley and Newberg in the Paris working and the Rites of Eleusis, which magic is outlined in Grimorium Sanctissimum, located as an appendix of Magic Liber Book 4. Further, the metaphysics behind Grimorium Sanctissimum is detailed in Crowley's Liber Agape. And I plan on going over Liber Agape and Grimorium Sanctissimum in the future in 2 separate videos. But for now, if we're looking at that same footnote, it does give a summary of these matters. Quote, "The semen of the magician is used as a vehicle of magical possession. By ejaculating the magically charged semen into the seer, the result is a species of possession as the seer becomes a homunculus, in that his or her own soul is dislodged temporarily for the purpose of an oracle," end quote. Next, we're going to discuss the latter process of the homunculus above, as outlined in Crowley's novel, Moonchild. In this novel, there's a war between white and black magicians taking place, and it's loosely based on real-world conflicts between Crowley and his AA with Mathers, Yates, and Waite. To skip most of the plot of the book, the short of it is that the group of white magicians find a woman who joins their order and falls in love with the member who introduces her. She is chosen as a suitable host for their homunculus, a Moonchild, and we will utilize quotes from the book outlining a hypothetical process to fully explain the concept. So, using the method from Moonchild, the same as outlined in 367 Part 3, suppose you're in a position of world leadership at times of war. Like Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, you discover that your true will is to lead an army into war. But suppose through divination or by visions bestowed from some great angel, you had plenty of time. Say you discover that you're going to lead this army into war 20 years prior to it. That you would be the one responsible to lead, and thus you have ample time to plot your course, rally your allies, and strategize accordingly. So in this scenario, you may find it beneficial to create a homunculus. You think it over and decide that the best course of action is to conjure Graphiel into a fetus so that he is incarnated, and thus you have the intelligence of Mars in physical form on your side of the battle. Chapter 8 of Moonchild talks about the ritual of conception and why in the novel they decided to employ this formula. Quote, "Magicians sought to make this homunculus in a way closer to nature. In all these cases, they had held that environment could be modified at will by the application of talismata or sympathetic figures. For example, a 9-pointed star would attract the influence which they called Luna, not meaning the actual moon, but an idea similar to the poet's ideas of her. By surrounding an object with such stars, with similarly disposed herbs, perfumes, metals, talismans, and so on, and by carefully keeping off all other influences by parallel methods, they hope to invest the original object so treated with the lunar qualities, and no others. I am giving the briefest outline of an immense subject. Now then, they proceeded to try to make the homunculus on very curious lines. They could arrange any desired environment from the beginning, if they could only manage to nourish the embryo in some artificial way, incubate it, in fact, as it is done with chickens today. Furthermore, and this is the crucial point, that thought that by performing this experiment in a specially prepared place, a place protected magically against all incompatible forces, and by invoking into that place some one force which they desired, some tremendously powerful being, angel or archangel, and they had conjurations which they thought capable of doing this, that would be able to bring the whole world into light and truth. End quote. So, in this hypothetical process, using this method of Graphiel as an example, the optimal time to inseminate the woman would be in Aries. This way, the fetus 9 months later would be born in Capricorn, which has Mars exalted therein. The female host must have characteristics of a Mars nature. Think Daenerys Targaryen from the Game of Thrones. For the duration of her pregnancy, she should be isolated and exposed only to that which is related to Mars. Further, she should have undergone banishment of everything not Mars-related before being placed in isolation. Then invocations of fire and Mars should be made upon her every day leading up to the insemination, and we're going to get more into what the rituals during pregnancy look like in a moment. Leading up to this conception date, your laboratory should be riddled with Mars influences. Paint the room red. Slaughter a goat to consecrate it as your place of working. Riddle the room with 5 Mars planetary squares, each with the sigil of Graphiel emblazoned upon it, in either red paint or goat blood, and symbols of the pentagram, etc. Use the magician's tables and get creative. You will want to perform daily leading up, say for 5 days, 5 weeks, or 5 months, daily 5 invocations of Graphiel, coaxing him into the temple. If you are willing to just imbue the fetus with Mars energy in general, instead of a specific entity, just like the Moonchild is just the moon in general, you could be less specific and work with Mars gods, low spirits, and everything in between. But since we started this hypothetical experiment with Graphiel, we will have Graphiel incarnate our fetus. You will want his sigil in a prominent place, drawn over her belly in goat's blood during the conception ritual, and daily before every invocation of him. Perhaps you would even use a triangle of art, having the mother stand therein and force him into the fetus when the time is right, preferably on a Tuesday, the day of Mars, at sunrise, the hour of Mars. Further, her diet should consist of Mars foods, as we'll get into in one of the next quotes. Goat meat and goat milk would be good, wild boar, foods that are red, spicy foods, apples, as they have what appears to be a pentagram in their middle when cut in half. And you'll see an example of what I'm talking about in just a second, food-wise. Chapter 14 of Moonchild has examples of rituals that take place during the pregnancy. Quote, "The hour of the rising of the moon was always celebrated by an invocation upon the terrace consecrated to that planet. A few minutes earlier, the mother Iliel rose and bathed, then dressed herself in the robes and placed upon her head the crescent-shaped tiara with its 9 great moonstones. In this, the younger girls took turns to assist her. When she was ready, she joined the other girl, and together they went down to the terrace, where Sister Clara would be ready to begin the invocations. Of course, owing to the nature of the ceremony, it took place an hour later every day, and at first Iliel found it difficult in accommodating herself to the ritual. The setting of the moon witnessed a second ceremony, directly from which she retired to her bed, with soft singing and music, or with the recital of slow, voluptuous poetry. Her natural disinclination to sleep was overcome, and she began to enjoy the delicious laziness of her existence, and to sleep the clock round without turning in her bed. She lived almost entirely upon milk and cream and cheese soft-curdled and mild, with little crescent cakes made of rye, with white of egg and cane sugar. As for meat, venison, as sacred to huntress Artemis, was her only dish. But certain shellfish were permitted, and all soft and succulent vegetables and fruits. She put on flesh rapidly, the fierce, active, impetuous girl of October, with taut muscles and dark, flourished, mobile face, had become pale, heavy, languid, and indifferent to events, all before the beginning of February. And it was early in this month that she was encouraged by her first waking vision of the moon. Naturally, her sleep had already been haunted by this idea from the beginning. It could hardly have been otherwise, with the inveterate persistence of the ceremonies. The three women always chanted a sacred sentence, Epildon, Epildon, Artemis, continuously for an hour after her couching, and then one of them went on while others slept. End quote. Over the course of the 9 months of pregnancy to birth Graphiel, you would follow the method outlined above. I gave examples of ritual just prior to the quote, but I will add that in addition to what I've already said, the mother should be exposed to everything related to Mars, including watching films about war or that has high testosterone imagery. For example, for music, Flight of the Valkyries is a good example of what should be played to induce war-based sounds and vibrations through the fetus. In chapter 22, the Moonchild is born. Quote, no sooner had they landed at Barcelona than Lisa became suddenly and terribly ill. After a week, the doctors decided upon a radical remedy operation. The next day, a girl child entered the world, very much alive, despite the irregularity of her entrance. No ordinary child either. She was a beautifully made baby with deep blue eyes. She was born with 4 teeth and with hair 6 inches long, so fair as to be silvery white. Like a tattoo mark just over the heart was a faint blue crescent. End quote. I have problems with the text Moonchild, not in the formulas that we've spoken about. It's just that Crowley's writing is not my favorite in this book, and he kind of goes all over the place sometimes, everywhere except in a coherent manner that would result in a solid plot and climax of the story. But in our example of Graphiel, the baby being born should be followed by some obvious sign, be it on the body, in a birthmark, or by events surrounding the child's life from infancy. I don't know what would suffice, but any magician who has done enough magic to see how the world suddenly has a ton of coincidences follow one's rituals and intents will know exactly what I mean. I want to tangent about Moonchild for just a second. It's like they have this baby, and I don't remember. It's been a few years since I last read the novel, but I don't recall the baby actually having any influence in the story, and it turns from a war between the white and black magicians to suddenly it's World War I or whatever, and it's the Allies versus the Central Powers, and it's just like, I don't really think the Moonchild affects the story at all, other than the rituals that happen to have it be born, and then it's born, and then the story's over. So that's my tangent about Moonchild. I know a lot of people like the book. I don't personally care for it as a novel. I think there are some cool instructions pertaining to the homunculus, but that's really about it. Tangent over, sorry. Back to our example of Graphiel as a homunculus. Once born, he should be trained in athletics and militia, but especially taught strategies of war. And that is it. If you truly had the magical prowess to affect the fetus, call down Graphiel, and coax him into it, this homunculus experiment would certainly be a success. Again, I am not for this practice, but I do find the subject fascinating on a theoretical level, and I do believe it would work. Having finished going over that method, I want to go back and quote from Chapter 8 of Moonchild. There is a passage I want to bring up because it takes us in a new direction. Quote, I may conclude this little sketch by saying that the idea has been almost universal in one form or another, the homunculus. The wish has always been for a messiah or superman, and the method some attempt to produce man by artificial or at least abnormal means. End quote. So this brings us to Jesus as a homunculus. In my view, Jesus is a mythology, not a real person. He was a mashup of several pantheon figureheads, including Hillel the Elder, Osiris, Dionysus, and Krishna, to name but a few. But for the sake of this content, suppose he was a real person in his mythos historical fact. We then have a messianic figure conceived via Mary after the archangel Gabriel comes to her in a dream and tells her he has planted God's seed in her as if he's an anti-incubus or some crap. That seed, which housed the very essence of God the Father, is magically charged so that the offspring would possess supernatural powers. He would not only command angels and demons, he would walk on water, transform water into wine, stretch out one fish and loaf of bread far enough to feed a large crowd with tons to spare. He would bring the dead back to life, perform exorcisms, lead a cult of cannibal worshippers, and then himself rise from the dead. So, not only is he a homunculus, but a zombie to boot. And then most importantly, he would descend to either hell or purgatory, depending on what sect of Christians you ask, and by doing so, open the gates of heaven. So every soul that died up to that point and beyond in future days would have a chance at eternal life in heaven, singing Kumbaya or whatever the they do up there. Losers. It's a wonderful example of what the homunculus, charged with the proper powers, could do. I say all of this sarcastically, again, as I don't hold Jesus to be a real person, though I do hold this practice to be serious. Magic works, and by my experiences invoking forces, I know that such entities are in fact real, in the sense that everything is real and not real, as we discussed in part 1 of chapter 18 about the body of light in Magic and Theory and Practice. Just to make a couple more notes about Jesus and what Jesus is, I think he's a wonderful metaphor and allegory. Yahashua, Yod-He Shin Vav-He, is just Yod-He Vav-He, God, the four elements, with the Shin, which represents spirit, stuck right in the center of it. It is the human as the four elements made conscious with the spirit. As far as the mythos surrounding his conception, the seed of God impregnating Mary, there too is good magical knowledge. The unity of everything in the universe prior to its being formed after the Big Bang is symbolized by light. Eternal, endless light. From this light came vibration, sound. The logos of God in many pantheons is what creates the universe. The seed of God is thus the logos which impregnates Mary. It is a spark of true will in Chakma the Father that inseminates Bina the Mother, who births the universe, clothed in time and form below the abyss. That process of creation is what is being conveyed in the story of the birth of Jesus. But I digress. Jesus is a homunculus, and homunculus are what we are here to discuss. So, I will endeavor to illuminate one further subject related to the homunculus before we end this topic, and that subject is the golem. Made infamous in Prague with a mythology that has lasted over 400 years, the golem is essentially an idol made of clay, imbued with magical powers to carry out a desired end. In the early 1600s in Prague, anti-Semitism was on the rise, and Jews feared being forced from their homes by the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II. He was the king of Hungary, then Bohemia, and finally Austria, from 1572 to his death in 1612. To protect his community as an act of self-defense, Rabbi Judah Lo ben Bazalel made a golem using Kabbalistic magic. According to legend, it would prowl the streets day and night, defending Jews from anti-Semitic attacks. To activate the golem requires a specific ritual, part of which includes inscribing the word Ameth upon the golem. Ameth, meaning truth, brings the golem to life, while it said removing the A, leaving meth, in English means death, puts the golem to sleep or takes the life away from it. Interesting, as the letter Aleph in Kabbalah corresponds with air. Just like we talked before, spirit is described as air, especially the ruach, the intellectual part of the soul. And the breath of God via the logos created the universe. God speaks and things were made. Humans, having the Ein Sof, the spark of God, of creation, within them, allows a magician to use magic to create, much like God itself. In Genesis, it was the Elohim who breathed life into the clay to make Adam, the first man. Angels are naturally above humans, closer to God, but we create life through procreation, or now in a laboratory, through our magics and rituals. And according to this myth, one can bring clay alive, so to speak, but not transform this earthy substance into human form, as did the Elohim. Instead, this clay is imbued with the spark of life, but remains clay, whereas the Elohim actually changed the clay into flesh. Now, it's debated whether this story in Prague is true, and widely held to be fiction. I don't personally believe that this happened. I think it's a good folklore with some interesting allegory. But there are many other examples of the golem, just as in this folklore. But rather than going over all the folklore and legends, I want to go to Rabbi Gershom Scholem, his book On the Kabbalah and its Symbolism. From pages 185 onward, for like the next 10 pages, he outlines the ritual of making a golem, though it should be noted that he opens the section saying, quote, "This procedure, if I am not mistaken, was a ritual representing an act of creation by the adept and culminating in ecstasy. Here the legend was transformed into a mystical experience, and there is nothing in the instructions that have come to us to suggest that it was ever anything more than a mystical experience. In none of the sources does a golem created in this way enter into real life and perform any actions whatsoever." End quote. So this implies that he either tried the method or spoke to people who did, and nothing on the physical plane happened. But a state of ecstasy ensued, so there was some kind of energy present, and if that's the case, it is possible that the golem is merely the physical representation of an astral being. Almost, I don't want to say like a voodoo doll, but almost in the way you use a idol to communicate with any spiritual entity. That's why we put statues of gods and goddesses on an altar, so it's like a telephone to that entity. And in this case, if that be true, one would treat the golem as a vehicle for a spirit on the astral, give it jobs, then that it would carry them out the same way an astral child formed as a result of sex magic does. Either that or the ritual that he had, and he has 4 of them, are fraudulent. Now, I don't believe a doll made of clay is going to animate as a result of a ritual, but I do have experience working with an astral child, so if that's the case here, then the ritual will have results. So let's see what the author prescribes. He gives some instruction from 4 different sources outlining 3 similar methods to make a golem. The first of these is an appendix to Aleister of Worms' issue of the Sefer Yetzirah. The ritual is as follows, quote, 2 or 3 adepts should take some virginal mountain earth, knead it in running water, and form a golem from it. Over this figure they recite the combinations of the alphabet derived from the gates of the Book of Yetzirah, which has 231, or in Aleister of Worms, 221 combinations. The characteristic feature of this procedure is not that the 231 combinations themselves are recited, but combinations of each of their letters with each consonant of the tetragrammaton according to every possible vocalization. End quote. What that entails is that by writing the 22 Hebrew letters in a large circle and connecting each letter to each other by drawing a line, the result is 462 combinations of 2-letter words. But after the first 231 combinations, the second 231 are mere permutations, meaning the letter combinations are just reversed. So when you divide 462 by 2, since they're going to repeat, you're left with 231. So they call it the 231 gates. In Appendix 3 of Sefer Yetzirah by R.E.A. Kaplan, you can find charts outlining the front and back of each of the 10 Sephiroth. Thus, these are the scripts that one would recite in making the golem. Note that Aleister of Worms worked out the prescribed 221 gates, but we're not going to go into that to save space. We just can't get into that, and we're not going to explain his reasoning now. But in Sefer Yetzirah, in this copy by R.E.A. Kaplan, both sets of 221 and 231 gates are available, and you could use whichever one you preferred if you wanted to try this. The result is to induce a meditative, altered state of consciousness, much like using a mantra, but also to invoke the powers of these combinations via the Tree of Life. These letters, in this format, have a very specific power, which when uttered, might be compared to how when uttering the barbarous names, energy comes forth. Only in this case, we are applying the specific force right into the clay to bring the golem to life, or to at least create some type of astral being overlaying the golem, which can then go out and do whatever you need it to do. One must then understand not only how to invoke force, but then to direct it into the clay. And this is very much like directing light with a magical wand. Now, Scholem's text adds that, quote, 1 prescribed order of the alphabet produces a male being, another a female. A reversal of these orders turns the golem back to dust. End quote. The second method by Scholem, quote, they make a circle around the creatures and walk around the circle and recite the 231 alphabets as they are noted. Parentheses, the author seems to have in mind such tables as we actually find in Eliezer of Worms. And some say the Creator put power into the letters so that a man makes a creature from virgin earth and kneads it and buries it in the ground, draws a circle in a sphere around the creature, and each time he goes around it recites one of the alphabets. This he should do 462 times. If he walks forward, the creature rises up alive by virtue of the power inherent in the recitation of the letters. But if he wishes to destroy what he has made, he goes round backwards, reciting the same alphabets from end to beginning. Then the creature sinks into the ground of itself and dies. And so it happened that Rabbi Ibe, with his students, who busied themselves with the book of Yetzirah, and by mistake went around backward, until they themselves, by the power of the letters, sank into the earth up to their navels. They were unable to escape and cried out. Their teacher heard them, came running, and said, recite the letters of the alphabets and walk forward instead of going backwards as you have been doing. They did so and were released from the earth. End quote. So this is similar to the first method, and the only change is, in addition to reciting the 231 gates, is you're adding the act of circumambulation to the ritual. Deosil, going around clockwise with the pattern of the sun, invokes and brings the energy of the golem to life, whereas walking backwards, the opposite way, Widdershins, opposite to the direction of the sun, brings death to the golem. The third method of Scholem is derived from Munich manuscripts that were in possession of the author. Quote, he should take pure earth of the finest sort and begin with combinations of the 231 gates until he receives the influx of inspiration, Shefa ha-Chakma, and he should recite these combinations rapidly and turn the wheel of combinations as fast as he can. And this practice brings the Holy Spirit, that is, inspiration. Only then, in such a state of mind, should he undertake the technical part of golem making. Then take a bowl full of pure water and a small spoon, fill it with earth. But he must know the exact weight of the earth before he stirs it, and also the exact measurement of the spoon with which he is to measure. But this information is not imparted in the writing. When he has filled it, he should scatter it and slowly blow over the water. While beginning to blow the first spoonful of earth, he should utter a consonant of the name, Tetragrammaton, in a loud voice and pronounce it in a single breath until he can blow no longer. While he is doing this, his face should be turned downward. And so, beginning with the combinations that constitute the parts of the head, side note, you'll see in the 231 gates, the Tree of Life, there's 10 different charts for the 231 gates, and they correspond with the 10 Sephiroth. So there are charts in the Magician's tables that correspond the Sephiroth to parts of the human body. So beginning at Kether and working down towards Malkuth, he should form all the members in a definite order until a figure emerges from the earth. End quote. I personally prefer this third method. I've never tried these, but it just sounds the best to me, as it includes the act of using one's breath to breathe power into the clay, much like the Elohim have done with Adam, according to Genesis. Now, none of these methods are like what was claimed to have been performed in Prague, just utilizing the words Ameth and Meth, which there's no other extant ritual made publicly available to anybody that tells us what the rabbi in Prague did to animate and deactivate the golem. Perhaps one can add that's one of these three methods, using the words Ameth and Meth. But I see why Scholem is saying that this is less about making a golem and more a meditative practice to, quote, demonstrates the powers of the holy name, end quote. Thereby one alters their consciousness and feels the power of the great name of Tetragrammaton. Anyways, having made the golem come to life, your next task is to give it objectives. Now, I've heard of Rabbi writing upon vellum the task which the golem should carry out, and that this vellum should be placed inside of the golem, rolled up before activating the golem. Else, I guess you could simply give directions verbally, orally, after the golem is brought to life. It's said that in the case of the Prague golem, the rabbi who made it had to deactivate it each Sabbath, being Friday night into Saturday, for rest on the holy day. Otherwise, it would become hostile and restless, wreaking havoc as opposed to carrying out its function. And I've already given directions based on which method you have employed, so I'm not going to repeat myself on how to activate, deactivate. And thus concludes the Golem. I will close by saying that though it is not initially imbued with a specific force via a working like Moonchild, like you're not going to make a Luna-based Golem, none of these instructions are planetary or elemental, etc. They're just using earth and water, so elemental in that sense, but they're not working with the energy of those sources, is what I mean to say. Even despite that, it is definitely in the category of a homunculus, a being made alive by ritual means to carry out a function. Now, in most cases, it is imbued with the Ein Sof via the Hebrew alphabet, which alphabet itself is said to derive from the holy source of creation. Thus is why the Hebrew alphabet is intrinsically linked with the Tree of Life. The letters of Hebrew are not like vulgar English or Latin. They're more like Enochian in that each letter is itself a holy symbol and carries the power of its correspondences. So in either case of using the 231 gates or the word Almeth truth to bring the golem to life, it is by power of the sacred alphabet, the Ein Sof, Kether, the light, that this particular homunculus is conceived and powered. So in that sense, I guess there is a sort of specific power, but it's just not like the other ones where you're going to do specific planetary rituals over an extended period of time to imbue this physical matter with that type of energy, if that makes sense. So it's just a little difference there, but this concludes our lecture on the homunculus. Again, I don't recommend doing this with fetus or in vitro fertilization. I just find the whole thing abhorrent. You could just use an astral child, meaning you create an astral being on the astral plane and give it directions. It happens every time one orgasms anyway, and I think that that's a much safer practice to direct that towards your true will and helping you accomplish the great work, as opposed to using any, human, treating it as some talismanic figure. There's just something there that seems wrong to me. So anyway, in the spirit of scholarship, I just wanted to give these practical points. I do find the concept fascinating. I think it is really cool, and I especially like the concept of the golem. A former friend of mine once went to Prague, and when she had come back, she gave me a little golem that she bought at like a gift shop, and so that's the image, the thumbnail that you'll see on the video screen at most times during this video. So that's an actual little mini golem that I have in my possession. I think it's very adorable. So I do like the golem. I prefer that over the Moonchild method of creating a homunculus, if you agree that they're in the same category. Love is the law, love under will. I'll see y'all in the next one.